Hilchos Shegagos Perek Revi, the laws of sacrifices for inadvertent transgressions, chapter 4. Today we have two questions that we're going to be dealing with. The first one is, if you enter a state of being unaware about certain prohibitions, and you commit multiple prohibitions, all while being in the same lapse of unawareness, do you have to bring just one sin offering, because it's all one unawareness? Or is it multiple sin offerings because you follow the sins and you did multiple sins, you got to bring multiple sin offerings? That one has a very short answer, right in the beginning of the chapter. The second question is the entirety of the rest of the chapter. And that's kind of the opposite scenario. What if you did one act, which in one, you commit multiple sins? We're going to have a bunch of different scenarios about that, where you do one thing, and that one thing incurs multiple sin offerings. And we're going to see that in many cases, you do have to bring multiple sin offerings for all the sins that are committed with that one act. So first, the easy part. Halacha Aleph, ha'oisa averes harbe behelem achas. A person commits many transgressions in one helem. Helem means hiddenness or concealment. It means in one lapse of awareness. You did a whole bunch of things. Chayav chatas al kol achas va'achas. We follow the sins, not your mind. You're liable to a sin offering for every individual sin. Afilu asa ha'arbayim v'shalish elu shemoninu behelem achas. Even if you committed all 43 of the sins which would require you to bring a sin offering, but you never became aware of what you did. You did all 43 in one lapse of unawareness. It's pretty hard to do because, as we saw, 26 of them involved forbidden relationships. Not getting into the technicalities of this, but it just brings out the point. The point is, the legal point is, that even if you committed all 43 in one state of unawareness, chayav arbayim v'shalish chatoyos, you will have to bring 43 separate sin offerings. And now, this is again the main thrust of the whole chapter, we go to the other side. V'chein, similarly, im asa ma'aseh echad, shehu chayav alav mishum shemes harbe, if a person commits one act, for which he is liable on multiple counts, chayav al kol shem v'shem, you're liable for every additional count, with one major caveat. V'hu, that is only provided, shahayu ha'isurin kulan bayin ka'achas, either all the multiple counts, all the different prohibitions, began to apply at the same time, and we'll see what that means, oy isur moisif, or the additional counts are what's called an isur moisif. An isur moisif, I'm going to simplify it to its most basic definition. An isur moisif means a prohibition whose scope encompasses more people. The classic example of an isur moisif is if you have a woman who is widowed, then she marries, and then she becomes divorced. While she's widowed, she's only forbidden to one person, to a high priest. Once she becomes divorced, she now becomes forbidden to all priests. So since the new prohibition has a larger scope, it covers more people. Therefore, if the high priest, who was already forbidden to her when she was widowed, if the high priest now engages her and marries her, he's liable on both counts, both for the widow count and for the divorce count, because when the divorce came into play, the scope was enlarged, and therefore it also applies to the original subject. Oy, isur koilel, or the additional count was an encompassing prohibition. And here again, to its most basic definition, isur koilel means also the scope is enlarged, but not to more people, rather to more entities. Classic example, which the Rambam gives himself. You have the gid hanasha. He doesn't give it here, he gives it in the laws of forbidden foods. You have the gid hanasha, you have the sciatic nerve in an animal, that's forbidden. Let's say that animal then gets a mortal wound, and it becomes a treifa. Now more of the animal is forbidden. More entities have been covered, not more people. Doesn't change the relevance of the prohibition to people. Everybody's forbidden to eat the gid hanasha, everybody's forbidden to eat treif. But more of the animal is forbidden. So the fact that more of the animal is forbidden also devolves onto the gid hanasha. And therefore, if you eat a gid hanasha that became treif, you're liable on 2 counts. These are the only 3 scenarios where multiple counts can take place over and above each other. They have to be either bayin ka'achas, either both prohibitions devolve at once, or they have to be an isur moisif, the second one has to have a larger scope of people covered, or an isur koilel, the second one has to have a larger scope of entities covered. And then Rambam's going to give examples, at least of the first 2 categories. We're not so much going to get an isur koilel, but at least the first 2. Ketzad, what does this look like practically? Hashoichet behemas kadashim chutz la'azara b'shabes la'avodah zara. Please follow this. You have an animal which is sanctified as a sacrifice. Where is the only place you can offer an animal sanctified as a sacrifice? It has to be in the temple. You take this sacrifice and you offer it outside of the temple. So now you've done one prohibition. Happens to be the calendar date which you chose was Shabbos, when it's forbidden to slaughter just for nothing. It also happens to be that this altar which you erected outside the temple is idolatrous. So you've taken a sanctified animal and you've slaughtered it outside the temple on Shabbos for idol worship. Chayav shalish chatois, you're liable 3 times. You have to bring 3 sin offerings if you did this all in a state of unawareness. Mishum sheichet kadashim b'chutz, because you slaughtered a sacrifice outside. Umishum mechalel Shabbos, and you have desecrated the Shabbos. Umishum eved avodah zara, and you have served idols. Shaharei shleisha sa isurin bayin ka'achas, because all these 3 prohibitions happen at the same time. Boom, the moment you slaughter the animal, you've just done 3 things, 3 separate things. Now, as we'll see, the Rambam will crystallize this in a moment. But medvarim amurim, when do we say this? Be'oimer, if the person stipulated that bigmar zvicha hu oivedaisa, that he wants the service of the idol to take place at the end of the slaughtering. But if he didn't have that in mind, the moment you begin to even slaughter the smallest slice, having intent for idol worship, already transgresses the prohibition of serving idols, and the desecration of Shabbos and the offering of the sacrifice outside the temple only take place once you're going to complete the slaughtering, once you cover at least a majority of the windpipe and the food pipe. So now the isurim are not bayin ka'achas. Now the prohibitions are not devolving at the same time. The prohibition of the idol worship devolves first, and then the desecration of the Shabbos and the offering of the sacrifice comes into play. And therefore, you're only held liable for the first count. You're only held liable for offering outside once you slaughter both pipes, or at least most of both pipes. Which means that when you finish the slaughtering, you've slaughtered a sacrifice which cannot be offered as a sacrifice. For which you're not liable for slaughtering outside. You're only liable for slaughtering outside an animal which could have been brought as a sacrifice. The moment you slit the animal's neck for idol worship, it becomes disqualified already. So therefore, all you have is the one prohibition of idol worship. But if they're bayin ka'achas, if you declared in your mind, I only want the idol worship to happen at the end of the slaughtering, so in that one moment you've done 3 sins. Let's consider a case where it wasn't an animal, it was a bird. It was a bird meant to be offered as a sin offering. And we know that when it comes to a bird, only one pipe has to be slit for it to be considered a kosher slaughtering. Let us further consider that half of its windpipe was already blemished, which is okay. It's not a mortal wound for an animal, for a bird. A mortal wound for a bird would be to have the food pipe sliced even a bit. But the windpipe, it can survive even if half of its trachea, half of its windpipe is split. So now, the haisif by kol shuhu b'Shabbos, l'shem avodah zara, same scenario. A person takes the knife and adds a tiny bit more to the slit in the windpipe, bringing it to a majority, which now completes the slaughter. And he does so on Shabbos for idol worship. Chayav shalish chatois. You'd be liable here for 3 counts. Offering it outside, offering it on Shabbos, offering it for idols. Because here all 3 prohibitions take place at once. And here it doesn't matter whether you had intent to service the idol in the beginning or the end. Because the only act that you did, the very first slit, completed the slaughter, desecrated the Shabbos, and was service of idols. Similarly, here we have this year, Tishrei. Last month, 5785, Yom Kippur fell out to be on Shabbos. It's forbidden to do work on Shabbos. It's forbidden to do work on Yom Kippur. You did work on this day of Yom Kippur, which falls out on Shabbos. Chayev shtei chatois, you're liable for 2 sin offerings. Because both prohibitions come at once. It's both Shabbos and Yom Kippur at the same time. One doesn't happen before the other. And here, let's throw in now Isur Moisif. Habal Eishes Achiv Hakayam Kishehinida. A person has relations with his brother's wife. His brother is still alive, and his brother's wife happens to be menstruating. So she's a nida now. Maybe shalish chatois, you've transgressed 3 sins that have to be taken care of. mishum eshes ish, umishum eshes ach, vehein shnei yisurin abayin ka'achas. First of all, you have the fact that this woman is a married woman and she's your brother's wife. Those are both prohibitions that apply at the same time. She doesn't become married before she's married to your brother. When she's married to your brother, she's both married and married to your brother. So those two prohibitions came at once. Plus, now that she's on her period, umishum nida, you also are held accountable for the nida prohibition, shahu isur meisif, because it is a prohibition which encompasses more people. Who else becomes forbidden to this woman once she becomes a nida? Her own husband. Because the prohibition of nida enlarges its scope by encompassing also her brother, it also becomes additional to her yavam, to the brother of her husband. And therefore, if Mr. Orange will have relations with Mrs. Blue while she's a nida, he'll be held accountable 3 times. And the same applies in all similar situations. Another law like this. Habal aviv. A person has relations with his own father. Chayav shtayim, he's held accountable for 2 counts. Achas mishum ervas avicha leisegale. 1, because the verse says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father. Umishum ve'ezachar leisishkav. And because Torah says, you shall not lie with a male. 2 prohibitions apply at once. Your father is both your father and a male. V'chein habal achi aviv. So too if somebody has relations with his paternal uncle. Chayav shtayim, also liable twice, because Torah singles him out. Shenemar, it says, ervas achi avicha leisegale, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. And it also says, ve'ezachar leisishkav, again, not to lie with a male. So now you have 2 prohibitions. Haba'al haschur, vehevi schur alav behelemachas. If a person commits homosexuality, both ways at once, he is copulating with a male, while the other male copulates with him, or a different male. Even if it's 2 different people, he is only liable once. Because it says, you shall not lie with a male. Torah gives the same name, the same title to the liar and the one who's being lied with. When it comes to a man, homosexuality both ways, it's one sin. Same thing if a person copulates with an animal and has an animal copulate with him in the same state of unawareness, he's only liable once. When it comes to both bestiality and homosexuality, both parties are considered one with regard to becoming obligated into a chatash, only liable once. Now we have what's pretty much known as one of the most complex halachas in all of Rambam. I don't think it's that complex. It's complex when you read it because you can't picture it. But if you can picture it, it becomes super simple. And basically, it involves the following. Let's just read the first line so we can get ready for what's coming. Halacha beis yesh bayel be'ila achas v'chayav aleha shmeine chatois. There is a scenario where somebody can engage in 1 act of relations and he'll be liable on 8 counts. He'll have to bring 8 sin offerings for this 1 act because the woman in question will be forbidden to him in 8 different ways. As we're going to see, this is only possible if certain sins are committed along the way. It's not possible naturally to have this many counts of 1 woman, but the Rambam wants to bring out the extremity of halacha, that if something were to happen and create more situations, the maximum you could have for 1 relations is 8 counts of sin offerings. And for this, we turn to this family tree. I know it looks very confusing. It's not that confusing. We're going to be using biblical references, because the Rambam does, although the family is not going to be exactly structured as we might know the biblical family to be. On the top of the family, we're going to have Yishmael and Yitzchak, 2 of Avram's children. And we're also going to imagine that they have 2 other brothers for the purpose of this halacha. Yitzchak, in the scenario of our halacha, is married to Rivka, as in the Torah, except that Yitzchak has his own children, at least 2 we're going to see, from a previous marriage, let's just say, and Rivka has 3 children from a different marriage. Together, when they got married, they gave birth to Yaakov. So Esav is not in the picture, but Yaakov does have a couple of paternal brothers and a couple of maternal brothers. All right? So Yitzchak and Rivka are married, they have Yaakov. Yaakov, in the scenario of our halacha, only has 2 wives, not 4. Rachel, who's the daughter of Lavan. Lavan is going to come into the picture here. And Zilpah. As we're going to see, from Rachel he has a child named Reuven and at least 2 other children. And from Zilpah he has Timnah. This is where the halacha begins. Okay, keep all this in mind, and we're going to be introducing more variables into the halacha, but the main focus right now begins over here, in this part of the tree. Says the Rambam, Ketzad, how do we get to 8 counts for one woman? Yaakov shehoisa leibas mizilpa ushma timna. Now, I've done already the structure for you, so you're already familiar. The Rambam kind of introduces new variables at every single line. That's why it becomes very confusing to keep track. But if you see it all in this picture, it's going to be very easy flow. Yaakov shehoisa leibas mizilpa ushma timna. But please pay attention, follow this carefully. Yaakov has a daughter from Zilpah. Zilpah is his wife. They have a daughter whose name is Timna. Nasa Lavan Timna. Please follow here. Lavan is up here. Lavan happens to be Yaakov's father-in-law with his other wife Rachel, which we're about to introduce in a moment. Lavan goes and marries this Timna. V'hoilid mimeno bas ushma Serach. And he has a child whose name is Serach. Please watch as the slide switches. 2 things are going to happen. Boom. There is Serach, the daughter of Timna. The reason I shaded this out is because I moved this also to here, just so you can see for clarity. Lavan married Timna, and they have a daughter, Serach. But the main focus is kind of over here, because what we want to look at is Serach in relationship to Yaakov. Serach's relationship to Yaakov right now is granddaughter. Granddaughter is a problem. One of the Torah's prohibitions to marry is a granddaughter, a daughter's daughter. Now, because Lavan happens to be the father of Yaakov's other wife, Serach therefore also becomes at the same time his wife's sister. It's forbidden to be married to 2 sisters. By the way, raises the whole question about Yaakov himself, who married 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. We're not getting into it. But definitely after Torah was given, this is for sure forbidden. So if you've watched what's happened right now, by the birth of this Serach, she has immediately become forbidden to Yaakov twice, on 2 counts. Once as a granddaughter, and once as a sister-in-law. So let's repeat that again. Nasa Lavan Timna v'hoilid mimeno bas ushma Serach. Lavan married Timna. They had a daughter whose name is Serach. Ve'ein leLavan bas ela Rachel levada. Besides for this Serach, Lavan has no other children besides for Rachel. The reason that I'm saying that is because again, you're using biblical reference. In biblical terms, we know Lavan had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. Here we're only worried about Rachel. Okay, Lavan's only daughter is Rachel. Nimtses. It turns out that Serach bas Yaakov va'achais ishtoi me'aviyah. That in the moment she was born, Serach is the daughter of Yaakov, and she's also his wife's sister, at least paternally. They share the same father. We don't know who Rachel's mother is. We know who Serach's mother is. It's Timna, definitely not Rachel's mother, someone else. But they're definitely sisters, at least from the father's side. So Serach again is both Yaakov's granddaughter and the sister of his wife. These are 2 prohibitions which devolve at once. And if in this moment, if right here, Yaakov were to engage in relations with Serach, he would be held liable on 2 counts. 1 for sister-in-law, 1 for granddaughter. The plot thickens, however. Watch the slide, please switch. Nises Serach liReuven. Serach grows up, and she likes her uncle, Reuven. Again, this is Yaakov's son, not from Zilpah. It's a son from Rachel. You're allowed to marry your uncle. That's totally fine. As a matter of fact, the Talmud even records in some cases it's a mitzvah for an uncle to marry his niece. Now again, I put Serach in here again, not because she's born again, just to help us keep track of all the things that she's been doing. She's the granddaughter of Yaakov. She's the son of Lavan, makes him the wife's sister. And now she's married to Yaakov's son, which makes him forbidden because of the daughter-in-law. Now, we've said that if a prohibition is introduced later, it cannot apply to the original subject unless it's an Isur Moisif, unless it encompasses more people. And it does in this case. The moment Serach marries Reuven, V'nesra al shar b'nei Yaakov, she becomes forbidden unto the other sons of Yaakov. Sons, at least 2, that's why I knew there's at least 2 here. Why can they not marry her? Because she is now their brother's wife. It's forbidden for you to marry your brother's wife. So because through this act, her prohibition encompasses a larger scope of people, therefore, Noisaf ba Isur liYaakov, she can also have an additional prohibition to Jacob, Baharehi Kalasai, as his daughter-in-law. Notice here, this is a very big novelty because there's 2 different prohibitions. right, on account of the fact that she has an additional scope of prohibition of Eishes Achiv, brother's wife, to Reuven's brothers, therefore we can allow the Isser of Kala, the Isser of daughter-in-law, to apply to Yaakov. There's some discussion here, the primary commentators get involved in it, but nevertheless that's accepted as a premise. Isser Moisif could even apply across multiple prohibitions, as long as the prohibitions are similar concepts, the idea of forbidden relationships. So, if at this point Yaakov were to have relations with Serach, now he's going to be able to count them on three counts. She's his granddaughter, she's his sister-in-law, and she is his daughter-in-law. Meis Reuven Geirash, this marriage gets dissolved. Reuven dies, or he divorces her. V'nisei Serach zu la'achi Yaakov me'imai. Serach is looking around for a shidduch. Guess there weren't many options. So she says, you know what? I can't anymore marry this generation because all the brothers of Reuven have become forbidden. I'm going to jump up a generation. I know my grandfather, Yaakov, has some brothers maternally. Remember I told you Yitzchak and Rivka were both married before. Yitzchak has kids, Rivka has kids. So Serach goes now and marries the brother of Yaakov from his mother's side. Let's watch the slide change here. Boom. Both Reuven and Serach got shaded out. Reuven because he died or divorced, his marriage is dissolved. And now she jumps up here to marry, this is Yaakov's brother. I know it's lower, so just pay attention to that concept here. It says Yaakov's brother from his mother. They share the same mother. Now, this is now Yaakov's brother's wife. Eishes Achiv. But it's a prohibition which is being introduced later. How can we hold Yaakov accountable for it? Says the Rambam, this is an Isser Moisif. Because at this moment, Serach becomes forbidden to the other brothers of Yaakov, and we're referring to the maternal brothers here. These ones become forbidden because now she is their brother's wife. Here Yaakov also is included in the scope, and now she is his brother's wife. Here it's actually the same prohibition. The same prohibition which encompasses his brothers encompasses him. This is actually much easier to understand. So now, at this point, I'm just repeating it just to kind of hammer it home. If Yaakov were to engage in relations with Serach, he'd be held accountable 4 times. Granddaughter, sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law from the other side, brother's wife. Meis Oigeirash. Says the Rambam, Mr. Anonymous brother dies or dissolves the marriage, gets divorced, and V'nisa Serach zu li Yishmael. So, Serach decides to go up a generation. She says, Yitzchak, my great-grandfather, has a brother, Yishmael is still alive, looking for a shidduch. I'm going to go marry him. Boom, let's see it come up into the chart. There it is. She's shaded out here. I should have shaded out this brother also because he also died or divorced. She gets married now to Yishmael. Yishmael is who? Let's keep track over here. Is Yaakov's uncle. Yaakov's father is Yitzchak. Yitzchak's brother is Yishmael. Torah clearly says it's forbidden to engage in relations with your paternal uncle's wife. This is a later prohibition, introduced now. Why does it apply to Yaakov? Says the Rambam. Because she becomes forbidden here to the other brothers of Yishmael, these 2 guys become forbidden to her. It's their brother's wife. We can also apply the new prohibition to Yaakov, paternal uncle's wife. Again, it's a different prohibition. The prohibition here added to the brothers is Eishes Achiv. This is Eishes Achi Aviv, but again, similar natures, so we're going to allow them to kind of coexist. And now, again, to solidify it, if Yaakov were to engage in relation with Serach at this point, there's now 5 counts. Granddaughter, sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law the other way, and uncle's wife. Meis Yishmael, says the Rambam, let's keep going. Yishmael dies, and it happens to be that Yitzchak is alive. V'nafla liyibum lifnei Yitzchak. The moment he dies, she needs to do yibum now with Yitzchak. Because let's say Yishmael died childless. I guess over here in these scenarios where Reuven died and the other brother died, either they got divorced or they died with children. So there was no need for yibum with the other brothers. But over here the Rambam is making the case, again just to bring out the point, he dies and she needs to do yibum now. Yitzchak is the oldest, he's the one who has to do yibum. levirate marriage. Now, even though Yibum is a mitzvah, Yitzchak is not supposed to do Yibum in this case. Why? Because Serach is also Yitzchak's great-granddaughter. Remember, Yaakov is his son, Timnah is the daughter, Serach is the great-granddaughter. Even though biblically only granddaughter is forbidden in relations, the rabbis extended this prohibition and said also great-granddaughters are included. So she is to Yitzchak what's called a shniya, secondary degree prohibition. He's not supposed to do Yibum. If he does though, the marriage is binding because Yibum is biblical and this is only rabbinic. So the Rambam says, for the sake of our case, V'avar Yitzchak v'yibma. Yitzchak transgressed and did Yibum with her. Afal pishi shniyala, even though she's a shniya, she's his great-granddaughter, shouldn't have married her. But, here's the bottom line. Yitzchak is married to Serach now. So now, says the Rambam, Serach, funny enough, has become the wife of Yaakov's father. Eishes Aviv. Mitoich shenesra al shar echav. Since this prohibition now devolves on Yaakov's other brothers, and here we bring in these brothers, as the commentaries say, this is Echav me Aviv. He has other paternal brothers. She has become the wife of their father. And there's a prohibition introduced for them. So since the scope is enlarged, Noisaf ba Isur li Yaakov mishum Eishes Aviv, we now have an additional prohibition to Yaakov because of father's wife. And here it actually is, again, the same prohibition for the brothers as that is for him. Eishes Aviv applies to them. Eishes Aviv also applies to Yaakov. So here what do we have now? We now have 6 counts. Right? If Yaakov were to engage in relations with her right now, based on what I've told you, there's 6 counts. She is, again, granddaughter, sister-in-law, daughter-in-law, sister-in-law the other way through the brother, uncle's wife, even though he's now passed away, and father's wife. The truth is, says the Rambam, I didn't tell you this before, but I'm going to make the point now, umishum eishes ish. She's also a married woman. Obviously at every point, she was also a married woman, so we'd have to go back and add an additional count. If you would have relations at any given point in time, there'd always be the additional count of the married woman, because she always becomes married and whatever kind of prohibition at the same time. Shashneo Yisurim Bayin Ka'achas, the 2 prohibitions come at once. Again, the Rambam could have mentioned this much earlier, but it only applies now in the final scenario that he's put out all the puzzle pieces and we see all the potential counts. Let's now also factor in the fact that she's a married woman, which is now a 7th count. Im Shagag Yaakov, Uba al Serach Zu, Kishehi Nida, if Yaakov were to act inadvertently and engage in relations with this Serach, when she's also a nida, which we said before, a nida is called an isur maisif because it also now encompasses her actual husband who cannot have relations with her. So if he did so, b'chaye Yitzchak baila, while Yitzchak, her husband, was still alive, u'b'chaye Rachel eishes Yaakov, and while Rachel, his initial wife, was also still alive, which would count for the sister over here, he'd be held accountable 8 times, 8 sin offerings. And the Rambam goes in order. Mishum bas bitay. First of all, she's the granddaughter, daughter of the daughter Timnah. Then, Mishum achais ishtay. She's the sister of his wife. Rachel is alive. Lavan was the father. Lavan was the one who married Timnah and had Sarach. Sarach is the sister of his wife. Umishum kalasai. She's his daughter-in-law. Reuven had married her. Umishum eshes achiv. Yaakov's brother, maternal brother, had married her. Brother's wife. Umishum eshes achi aviv. Paternal uncle's wife, because Yishmael had married her. Umishum eshes aviv. His father's wife, because Yitzchak is still married to her. Umishum eshes ish, she's a married woman. Umishum nida, and she's a menstruating woman. So we now have 8 counts. And the same applies in all similar situations. If you can construe multiples of cases of complex issues and stuff like that, you may accrue to more and more prohibitions so long as you stay within the guidelines of the Torah, which is that any count you're going to hold them accountable for have to either have devolved at once, or if they were introduced later, they have to have a larger scope of people or entities. Halacha Gimel says that I'm on one large caveat to this family tree here. Kol elu shete'aser zuha erva alein be'isur maisif. Anytime all these people to which this woman is successively becoming prohibited with these new prohibitions, tzarich sheyehu ha'anashim ha'acherim mitzuyin ba'olam kedei shete'aser alein. The other people who we're factoring in have to actually be alive, so that the prohibition can devolve on them. And because the prohibition devolves on them, therefore it devolves on this person. In other words, as we were saying before, every time we said when Reuven married this woman, we said because there's a prohibition to the brothers, therefore there's a prohibition to Yaakov. These brothers have to be alive. If they're not alive, if they aren't alive, we don't say, and since if, in the potential, if he would have had sons or brothers, she would have become forbidden to them, therefore the new old man, Yaakov in this case, should have a new prohibition. Right now there's no son, there's no brother. They aren't there. That's why I had to draw these brothers in. Because you have to show you that the brothers are alive, and then when Reuven marries, they get a prohibition, or when this brother marries, they get a prohibition, or when Yishmael marries, they get a prohibition. And because they get a prohibition, therefore Yaakov gets a prohibition. And the same thing applies in all other situations. Halacha Daled, an interesting exception to this concept. And again, it's a little bit of a complex family tree, just try to follow it. Misha haya nasui shalish nashim. A person is married to 3 women. Uba al ima shal achas mehen, and he engages in relations with the mother of one of the women, who happens to be shehi ein ima shel shniya, who happens to be the maternal grandmother of the second one, shehi ein aviha shel shlishis, and she happens to be the paternal grandmother of the third one. We drew it a little backwards, but let's just consider the case. Here's the old woman. She has a daughter, a son, and a daughter. One of her daughters, straight up, married this guy. Her son had a daughter, and the daughter married this guy. Her daughter also had a daughter who married this guy. So if you think about it, this one woman is his mother-in-law, his father-in-law's mother, and his mother-in-law's mother, right? Mother-in-law through here, father-in-law's mother through this woman, mother-in-law's mother through this woman. That's 3 separate prohibitions. Says the Rambam, Afal pishas keinazu, hi chamoisai, ve'em chamoisai, ve'em chamiv, even though this woman here is both his mother-in-law, and the mother of his mother-in-law, and the mother of his father-in-law, ushleisha shemaisein, which are 3 separate counts. So the easy way to get out of this is to say that maybe he married the woman at different times. So there's no isur basachas. They didn't come at once. So there's no additional prohibition. But the Rambam says, let's say even the isur basachas, let's say it is a case where it's all one prohibition, and the Talmud explains, and the commentaries explain that the case would be where he consecrated all of his wives through an agent. So they all took effect at once. So this woman became all 3 things at once. Can you imagine? A shvigar is enough to deal with. She's a mother-in-law, a mother of a father-in-law, and a mother of a mother-in-law. So by the principles of Isur Basachas, for this man to engage in relations with this woman should cover him with 3 times of sin offering. Says the Rambam, in this specific scenario, only 1 sin offering is incurred. Because when Torah describes the principle of a mother and her daughter, in other words, not being married to a mom and a daughter, or a grandma and a granddaughter at the same time, it says, uvas bina, uvas bita. Actually, Torah says, esbas bina ve'esbas bita. Sha'arahena zimahi. They are all related, and therefore it's adultery. But Torah kind of puts them all in one pot. Hakasuv asa shleisha gufin keguf echad. Torah makes the grandmother, the granddaughter, and the granddaughter like one body. Lefichach yechashvu ashleisha shemis keshem echad. Therefore, in this scenario, we're going to consider these 3 counts as one count. She's a mom, she's a grandma in 2 ways. It's all one thing described by the Torah, and therefore you get only 1 sin offering. Halacha hey aval, however, unlike in the last halacha where Torah kind of jumbles together, even though you have 3 different prohibitions, Torah makes it as one. But here's another scenario where you have 3 prohibitions and you'll be held accountable 3 times. Habo ala choisei. If somebody has relations with a sister, shehi achois aviv v'hi achois imoi, and this sister also happens to be his paternal aunt, the sister of his father, and his maternal aunt, the sister of his mother. It's a very tragic, incestuous case, as the Rambam is about to describe. But if one could construe this, and a person would have relations with this woman who is simultaneously 3 things, sister and aunt from both sides, chayav shalish chatois, he'd be held liable 3 separate times, 3 separate sin offerings. Shenemar, because the Torah says when it describes the prohibition of a brother and a sister, it says, it repeats the words, ervas achois gila. He has revealed the nakedness of his sister, which means that even if your sister also happens to be other things, chayav ala choisei bifnei atzma, you're going to be held liable for the fact that she is your sister on its own, even though she also happens to be the sister of your mother and the sister of your father. How do we construe such a case? And again, it's very tragic, full of incest. But we have to describe it so we can appreciate the extremity of halacha. Kegoyin, it begins with a person, shabo al imay, who has relations with his own mother. This gray line represents the fact that it's a child-parent relationship, but now he kind of marries her. He has relations with her. And he gives birth with her to 2 daughters. So now these 2 daughters have these 2 as parents. So to him, they're daughters. Relative to this mother, though, they become his sisters because they both share the same mom. It gets worse. Ubal achas mibnaisav. Mr. Incest also has relations with one of his daughters. V'hoilid mimena bein. And she begets him a son. So now let's consider this person's relationship to the other daughter, because this is going to be the case where it all happens. Says the Rambam, K'sheyavei hamamzer hazeh. If this illegitimate child will have relations al habas hashenis with the other daughter that was begotten by his father from his own mother, she will now be 3 things at once. First of all, shehi achais imay hamamzeres. She is the sister of his mother, who herself is illegitimate, right? Because this person's mother has a sister that came from this father-mother relationship here. So this person, to him, is a maternal aunt. Shehi achais imay aviv. Tragically also, she is his own sister, because they both share the same father. He came from an incestuous relationship between the father and the daughter. She came from a relationship between the father and his own mother. But this father begot both children. Shehi achais aviv me'imai. And if you want to go further, she is also his paternal aunt. She's his father's sister because they share the same mother. So with this relationship, you've incurred 3 things. Chayav shalish chatois, he'd be liable 3 times to the sin offering. Same thing would apply in all some situations. Over here, we're not going to free you with the one license fits all. You're going to be held accountable for each count individually.